Welcome to the Jay Kim Show. This is your host, Jay Kim. I am an investor, author, and fitness entrepreneur, and for the first time in Asia, I sit down with the world's most brilliant minds in business, investing, and entrepreneurship. You'll learn all the secrets, strategies, and formulas to becoming a successful entrepreneur directly from the masters. If this is your first time listening, thank you for stopping by. This podcast is produced every week with the goal of providing actionable insight to you, the listener, with every single episode. And now, on to the show. We have another special episode for you. Today's show guest is somewhat of a celebrity in the tech world. His name is Kevin Kelly, and he is one of the co-founders and editors of Wired magazine. Wired magazine is the premier magazine that focuses on how emerging technologies affect culture, the economy, and politics. Kevin is also the author of several best-selling books, his most recent being a New York Times bestseller called The Inevitable, where he discusses the 12 technological forces that will shape our future. We go over a lot in this episode, from his views on education — he didn't go to high school or college — the value of travel, the next biggest thing in China, and what it means to have 1,000 true fans. And of course, we talk about what we can expect to happen with technology in the future. This is such a good episode, touches on a lot of big topics, but I know you guys will get a lot of value out of it. Let's get on to the show. Kevin, thank you so much for joining the show today. We're very excited to have you on, and we appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So this is kind of interesting because I feel like a lot of the listeners out here might have actually heard of you because you have a very unique relationship with Asia. But perhaps for those who are listening and that don't know who Kevin Kelly is, you could give us a little quick intro. Who's Kevin Kelly? What do you do for a living?
I package ideas. I mostly view myself as an editor. I was editor and publishers of the Whole Earth Review, which was the Whole Earth Catalog's ongoing publication. I got involved in one of the co-founders of Wired magazine, which is still going, although I don't edit it any longer. And I write books and run a website, and the books are about technology and what they mean, and the websites are about tools, cool tools. My current project that I'm working on this year is called Vanishing Asia, which is documenting the disappearing traditions, customs, festivals of Asia between Turkey and Japan.
That's fascinating. I think that being Asian myself and living in Asia currently, I think that that's often overlooked. We're also focused on the future and where that's going, and we forget what is disappearing, I guess, behind us. I go to China a lot, and I do a lot of speaking in Asia, and I'm there to learn what Asians have in mind for us in the future, because I think they're going to decide. At the same time, I'm documenting what's lost, and I'm not really nostalgic about it. It's I understand why it's being left behind, but I just find a beauty in it that I'm trying to capture. Right. So let's dig way back. You used to be a photographer, is that right? And through that occupation, so to speak, you did extensive traveling in Asia when you were younger. Was that sort of the reason that you have this sort of connection with Asia?
Yes. It's kind of the first place I went to outside of my little parochial area in New England. And in early 70s, I first went to Taiwan, and then Japan and Korea, Philippines. Went later on to Southeast Asia, Central South Asia, and went westward, eventually Iran and Turkey. And it was my college, my graduate degree, my awakening. Those first journeys were just so mind-blowing. It's particularly at that era in Asia itself, which was in transformation. And so I gave myself the self-assignment to photograph in Asia. And I had almost no money, but I had a lot of time. And I traveled everywhere, and it was a very, very special moment in the world when someone like me with almost no money could journey pretty easily to places that were still living in the medieval 15th century and hadn't really changed. Before that time, you needed kind of like an expedition and permits and stuff to get there. And then after that time, of course, anybody could get there, but things had already changed. But there was this moment when things were unchanged, right? Poised in the past. And then I could take a bus or a Jeep or somehow and get there and see this before it just kind of vanished. That was really special.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you were a nomad, digital nomad before that term really existed. Yeah,
and I was very undigital. I mean, I was carrying 500 rolls of analog film in my backpack.
Analog nomad.
Exactly. I had. I would have died for a digital camera to do what they did, but it was strictly analog, and I literally had a backpack that had almost nothing in it except for film, and taking care of that, minding it, because it couldn't get too hot, and it was this incredible headache getting it back, not losing him. What was a minor chore in itself, and so it was a very analog world, nothing digital about it. I was traveling, I was a young kid, early 20s. And my parents had no idea even what country I was in. There was very little ways to communicate with them. I'd write, a letter every now and then. There was no phones. There was no telegraph. Of course, there was no messaging. And so it was as undigital as you could imagine.
And how did you... Were your parents supportive of you just taking off? And you've spoken before extensively advocating travel and this sort of thing. I follow your work. I followed it for a while. But there's always the conversation that you have to have with your parents, and obviously, people still value the institution of education, and especially in Asian culture, it's seen as sort of a must-do. So what was that conversation like with your parents, and were they supportive, or was there any sort of fallout, or I mean, how did you make that decision?
Well, I went to a school where 95%, 98% of the kids would go on to college, and we moved to this one town, a suburb of New York City, with that idea. My parents' idea. They were both college graduates at a time when not that many people were, and they totally expected that. My dad worked for what we would now call a media firm in New York, and but I decided that I would give it a try. I didn't really want to go, but I tried it for a year, and it didn't work out. And I was doing so many things. What I needed at that time was something we would call like a gap year or internship. That did not exist at that time. Had it existed, I would have done that and probably gone back, but that was not an option. And so when I dropped out, they actually weren't either surprised or concerned. Their major concern was I was the oldest of 5 kids, only 5 years apart, 1 year apart each.
Oh wow!
They were concerned about the influence that I would have on the other kids,
right?
On my brothers and sisters. And as it turned out, they all went on go to college, and so that wasn't they didn't really have much concern with me because I was doing so many things, and pretty self-motivated that they knew it. I think their concerns were more like, going into Afghanistan or into the Himalayas just in terms of my safety.
Right.
And because, news from back then was pretty scarce. And my second brother who did go to college did wind up traveling later on after college, even more than I did. And there was a moment when my parents got a postcard from me in India, my brother in, I think, Bolivia, saying he had hepatitis.
Oh, no.
So I think that's the kind of thing that they were concerned about. And, at that time, there were even, harsher things than hepatitis about.
Slightly more concerning than finishing a college degree, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Getting malaria or whatever, which were distinct possibilities. In general, just to answer your question, I think if we were kind of hanging around doing nothing, but what Asia was for me was like a graduate degree in how the world works and Asian studies. I basically gave myself a doctorate in Asian studies because there was just so much, and we were learning so much, and they were very happy that I was doing these things, and there were some senses and proud because again in the early 70s, 60s and 70s, it was very, very rare for people to get to these kind of places, even people with money. And it wasn't like today where people, fly off to Bali. And so they were kind of proud that, I was doing these things and getting to see these things and recording them on film. And so I think they kind of intuitively understood the larger benefits that you'd get from that, from not just being there, but having accomplished that. And so, it took a little bit of extra gumption and go-how to arrive there and survive there and come back. And they didn't give me any money. I did this all on my own, and I earned my own money and paid for my way and paid for everything. So I think they were proud, and I think even today when it's a lot easier, we should definitely give points to people for traveling in places that they're not familiar with, because it does require a certain amount of ambition to go and do that.
Absolutely. I think that the life skills are just invaluable, and even and I think you've talked about this before. I have three very young kids. My oldest is only 3.5, but even for her, when we go traveling somewhere outside of her comfort zone, even to Singapore or somewhere close, you can see the changes. She matures. It's like a level she steps up each trip that we take, and it's very noticeable. And I guess it's because you're being pushed out of your comfort zone and having to adapt. So, now how did that translate into your children? Were they able to, this is a large conversation about, it could spiral into a large conversation, but, my concern is the future of education. And, I living in Hong Kong, education is one of these things where it's kind of like New York City, I guess, or any major city where all the kids want to go to the most prestigious, best schools, and there's only a handful of slots. And so it creates a very strange dynamic. What are your thoughts on the value of even going to a traditional educational institution such as high school or college? Even
well, when it came to our own kids, we have 3. Of course, my wife and I have been married for 30 some years. We agree almost everything. The one place we have a little disagreement is on education. She's Chinese, and so she has a very traditional must-do attitude about it, and she has multiple, degrees, and she's a scientist and picked her way very early on. But what we kind of compromised what I told the kids is you don't need to go to college, but you do need, after you graduate from high school, to be doing something where you're learning something, and that could be traveling around the world. It could be interning somewhere, working on a project, but you have to have something structured, some form of what you're doing, and come back and tell us, and we'll support you, and then come back and tell us about what you're doing. If you can't think of something like that, then you have to go to college. And so that for them, I posed it as kind of like a second choice, and they all did eventually. They did not go out on their own. They actually just referred to go to college, and that was the deal. So I think still it's up to the individual. I think if you are a self-motivated person and can arrange your day so that you are optimizing your learning and whatever it is, then you don't really need college. If you are not that kind of person where you need an extra incentive and motivation to complete things, then having an institution and teachers on the side are a good idea. Or some combination of the two.
Right.
The one thing I do kind of get a little worked up by is the focus on what I called elite branded colleges.
Right.
So I find that they're completely, vastly overrated. And if you do decide to go, you know, if you can get into an elite branded, why not? But it's really misguided in many ways. And if you're really concerned about optimizing your learning, you probably would do better in one that doesn't have such a coveted brand. You'll get a lot more personal attention and probably come out the better for it. So, it's just like brands than anything else.
There's a lot of hype.
Yeah, it's branded jeans. It's like, it depends on what the brand is, but I think if you're showing off just for status, then that's really not the best way to do an education. Although, I understand why people might want to get in, and if you do get in, fine. But understand that it's almost a lottery at this point. You talk to any admissions persons in those highly sought after colleges, and they will tell you that basically it is, 95% of the people who are applying would be qualified,
right? And
they can make a class out of that, but they're doing all this kind of very esoteric balancing and whatnot, and it's really it's a kind of a meaningless game at this point.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of shenanigans. Well, I like that. I like that that you gave colleges the backup to the children if they didn't have a better option. I may have to use that one in 10 or 15 years time. I would have
preferred if they didn't,
but
but if they didn't, they really did need to have a program where they were doing things, and I think. It really does depend on some kids, need the incentive and the guidance, I guess I would say. Of others, they're not going to be able to do a year of their own independent work and really stick to it. So you kind of have to be ready for this. Maybe some homeschoolers might be able to do that. But then the problem with homeschoolers is they don't even have they usually want the experience of having organized education after 12 years of being at home. Right. So they usually go the other direction. But I do recommend actually homeschooling. We did homeschool our son for a year, and that was a blast. And it really helped him later on. He needed it at that moment, and if that's something you can swing. it's very rewarding for everybody involved.
You know, one of my wife's closest friends has 3 kids, and she actually homeschools her kids, and also travels extensively with the kids, which I think is fantastic because she's not tied down to any sort of school schedule. My only concern with the homeschooling, and I told my wife this, was I feel insecure that I'd be able to provide them the instruction or curriculum, and I don't know how these things work. I'm sure there's courses that you follow and this sort of thing.
There's so many stuff. Khan Academy, which we used, a lot of homeschool textbooks. There's textbooks that are kind of engineered with the homeschooler in mind. There's no end of curricula stuff, and the other things that you would do actually in the end are more important. I think there's really only one meta skill that you want to impart kids and by the time they graduate, and that is the skill, the ability to learn how to learn. Because we're all going to be newbies forever. They're going to be having to learn new things. It doesn't matter kind of what computer language you teach them, whatever, that's going to be obsolete very quickly. The facts they can look up, they can Google, you can ask a machine for answers. But that skill of learning how to learn and have that love of learning and how to ask questions, all these kinds of things, that is really the only important thing that they need to have. And I think these other kinds of activities that you're doing are much stronger accelerants in learning those skills.
Right.
And the teaching the calculus, whatever it is like that is just such a minor thing compared to these other things. We actually, in our son in 8th grade, we actually hired a mathematics professor at the local university to come to the house to tutor him in math. And that was like completely affordable. And if you have more than one kid, those kinds of deals are actually far cheaper than a private school. And so, that kind of stuff you can hire out as part of your homeschooling mix.
Right. That's interesting to me. So I guess at some point I imagine it's because of your work at Wired magazine, but you have become sort of this authority on technology and the future, a futurist, if you will. I believe one of the books that you wrote earlier on sort of was translated into Chinese and has a sort of viral following. Maybe you could talk about that and that experience. Yeah,
I've written, depending how you want to count them, at least 4 books, but more that I have written parts of, 4 I've written all of. And the first book that I wrote, which was published in the U.S. in 1994, was called Out of Control. And it was an early roundup of all the ways in which technological systems were becoming very, very complex and were mirroring the complexity of biological systems. So it was a book that talked about like beehives and the internet and how evolution worked in natural world and how artificial evolution could work on machines and computers, and it was the kind of very beginnings of the internet, and I talked about decentralized systems and how they would work. And so in many ways it was kind of an attempt to talk about this organic internet-like thing that was beginning to be born. And in the U.S. the book was published a little too early. They didn't really kind of get what I was talking about. But in China, it was translated late. It was translated just 5 years ago, I think. And it came out at the right time as the Chinese internet founders were founding their own companies like Alibaba and Tencent, and they read the book. in translation, and they were very influenced by it. Kind of like laid out the power of how you have social networks and network effects and all this kind of stuff. And so they were very influenced by it, and they shared they were fans of it, and so it spread in that way. And I wrote a follow-up book called The New Rules to the New Economy, which came out, unfortunately, in the U.S. right at the dot-com bust. People thought I was talking about the dot-com companies, but I was talking about the new internet economy, which later came, and it was the online world, and I was trying to talk about the new principles like follow the free, freemium pricing, and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So that was also a little too early. And my second to last book was called What Technology Wants, which was a theory of how technology happens. And my theory was that it was an extension of evolution, the forces of evolution, that operated very much like natural evolution did. And it was kind of a broad cosmic view. The latest book, The Inevitable, which has also been translated into Chinese and became a bestseller there just this year, is about the next 20 to 30 years of technological evolution and its general trends or trajectory, just directions in a broadest sense, not in the particulars of like whether Apple's going to work or not.
Right.
So most of my fans are in China. I have a lot more fans in China than in the U.S. And that's just a quirk of the timing, because being too early can be as bad as being too late.
Right. I love that. That's so interesting. What are some of the broad strokes of that you maybe could share with us from The Inevitable, which obviously was a New York Times bestseller last year, and it's having great success in the global markets. What are some of the things that we can look out for on a broad basis in the future?
Well, there are 12 trends or directions I talk about in the book, and they're all labeled as verbs. They're kind of I think they're called present participles. They're movements, and what I'm saying is kind of like all things being equal, they're going to move in this direction. There's no endpoints, but there's going to be more and more filtering. Our lives will have more and more tracking. No matter what else happens, more of our lives will be tracked. There'll be more and more flows of data, and they tend to flow rather than be, things are kind of like moving from being solid to liquid verbs, to things that move, to processes. So instead of having a product, you're going to have a service. Instead of having a noun, you're going to have a verb. So there was this movement away from the tangible to the intangible. And there's this movement from owning things to accessing things. If you can grab or demand or get something anywhere, anytime,
right,
and then leave it behind, why would you want to own it? So the virtues and benefits of ownership diminish, and the virtues and benefits of accessing something you don't own increases. And so there's these trends. And then behind all of it is this larger trend of this cognifying, of making things smarter, particularly artificial intelligence, making things very, very smart, making everything a little bit smarter and some things very smart. And that cognification is in some ways the enabling technology, the technology that enables all these other things to happen, and is, in my opinion, the foremost, greatest change force that's going to be at work in the 20 to 30 and beyond period, that not over on the longer term of 50 to 100 years is going to be the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution,
right,
and artificial power, which transform our lives. So that electricity and coal and gasoline and all that artificial power, which we added to our own natural power, natural muscle power, transformed our where you live, everything you see or surrounding you, whatever the listener sees. It's all been generated by having access to this artificial power, which became cheap and ubiquitous. And as we make artificial intelligence in many, many varieties, many types, many kinds, none of it really like human intelligence, all of it very different, but that artificial intelligences, that artificial smartness is going to impact all aspects of our lives, from sports to religion, food, clothing, education, military, business, and it's going to have a huge impact through billions of people, and that's already beginning right now. We see this first wave of it, of many waves to come, and so I'm trying to describe a little bit about some of the ways that the initial, the second and third, some of the things that would change our lives in the second and third waves of these.
Fascinating. How about China specifically? China is one of these things that, I'm sitting right next door here in Hong Kong, and the speed in which just things are changing across the border is, I can't even keep up with it. And I think when you say China, if you're from the West, you kind of have this strange notion. It's kind of like this far off land. But you can't ignore it because it's obviously on the trajectory to taking over the U.S., if not already by some metrics or standards. And it's just exciting what's happening over there. I'm a U.S. citizen, but I just got my 10-year visa. I didn't even know they had them, but they do.
I know.
And
that's a secret.
Yeah, it's a secret. Yeah. What do you think, Kevin, on what's the future of China? That, like, anything that obviously it's growing and it's going to change the world, so to speak, with all the innovation that's happening. Any talking points off the top of your head that you can clearly define?
So the first thing I would say about China is anything you want to say about China is going to be true. It is so vast that even the Chinese don't really understand what's going on. That's the thing. It's vast and it's fast, and so while as Americans feel like I have no idea what's going on, well, the Chinese have the same thing. Like, here you are in Hong Kong, and you don't feel like you can really understand the extent of everything, and you can't. It's beyond a person. It's beyond institutions. So and the not just the speed, but the distance, because you have parts of China that are still medieval, and next door or the next town is this futuristic town. So the distance that's being traveled is also vast, the distance in time. So so while there's the most amazing and futuristic stuff, on the other side of the country is is stuff that hasn't changed in a long time, and that's all happening at once. So anything you want to say about China is probably true, and I go there to see what's in store for us, because the arithmetic is just in the favor of China and, say, India. Together there's 3 billion people compared to 300 million in the U.S. I mean, it's 10 times. And so I think my own estimation that, China's maybe 5 to 10 years till they reach a threshold where they actually produce a truly global product that everybody in the world wants, not just for internal consumption, but they actually are able to make a brand, make a something that everybody wants. Maybe it's an electric car, or maybe it's a self-driving car, or maybe it's a robot. I don't know what it is. It's something that everybody in the world wants, and it's considered the best there is.
Right.
And so, right now they're still like in a copy culture, as Japan was for a very long time. And then Japan broke out, and they started to make, the Sony Walkman or the cameras and things that everybody wanted, and they made the best. I think China is nearing that moment, and
I think there are a couple things actually that might actually be there, like something like the DJI drone. I think that's pretty world class. No,
drone, right? Yeah,
and that's over in Shenzhen.
Right.
Yeah,
especially the little one.
Yeah,
the Maverick, and now the new Spark. Actually, my son interned at DJI.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, at they set up an annex in San Mateo, and he was involved in starting up their place in the U.S. So, I think, but not everybody in the world wants. I mean, it's like not. That's still a SO. It is state of the art. It is the best, but it's not quite consumer level at this point. But that's a good indication of how close they are. There's the guys at EHang doing the personal passenger drone,
right?
Which parallels the people at Kitty Hawk doing, the Google folks doing theirs, and there's 10 others. But the thing is, I'm trying to say is, I think the country as a whole is getting close to the point where they can have an ongoing, consistent delivery of goods. And I think there's a couple cultural improvements, cultural changes that are working on. One is a little wider acceptance of failure as a means of learning, failing forward, rather than being penalized for failure, which is still a little bit here, a little bit present. And then the questioning authority, questioning assumptions and authority, which is still a little difficult to do, both in terms of the education patterns and also the political pattern. So I think those will take a long time, but we know just from Chinese expats and the number of Chinese working over in the U.S. and Silicon Valley that there's nothing really deeply impossible about those things, because Chinese scientists and engineers in the U.S. are fantastically creative and innovative, and so there's not a huge barrier to do that. It's just a very, very deep, widespread cultural thing that they'll take a generation or so to overcome. But anyway, so once that happens, my gosh, I think it'll be kind of a new world when there's a lot of innovation coming out of China and maybe eventually India, and that will accelerate the way things go, but also change the dynamics, I think, of the economies and the political structure. So there's going to be a lot of shifting. I think Trump is an exhibit of the last gasp of an America that's no longer. And part of it is this industrial model that's gone, and the identity of a lot of older workers, of who they were, and the image of the new Americans as much more multiracial and a lot of more minorities, right. And where the U.S. is not the only superpower in the world. That is psychologically a very difficult thing to accept, and so I think we're seeing some of the pain of that right now. But I think it's going to take a whole generation to overcome.
I think I find it fascinating when you talked about what seems to me a very characteristic of Asian culture, which is those 2 points that you said, the fear of failure. Asians particularly, they have this whole have to save my face. I can't look vulnerable type mentality, which really impedes innovation. Absolutely, because we all know that you have to fail to succeed eventually. I think you're right, Kevin. I think in a generation's time, when that is become accepted as part of the rite of passage, then we could see quite an explosion of innovation thereafter. Last sort of topic that I want to talk about with you, since I have you on, is actually about an article, a very sort of viral, famous article that you wrote called "1,000 True Fans." And for listeners listening in, if you haven't read it, it's probably worth reading over at Kevin's website. Can you give us 5 minutes, the quick and dirty of your idea behind 1,000 True Fans?
The premise is kind of some sleight of hand with some numbers, and it says basically that in the new environment, in the new economy, that if you can have a direct relationship with your customers, with your fans, with your audience, and they can pay you directly for whatever it is you provide them. Say you're a creator, you're a filmmaker, musician, photographer, sculptor, game maker, whatever, and you can have your audience pay you directly. That you need a whole lot less of a fan base to make a living than you would if in the old world of media, where you had book publishers and music labels and movie studios in between you and them, and that the numbers work out. Like if you could sell these true fans, and I define a true fan as somebody who would buy whatever you produced. If you could sell them, $100 worth of stuff a year, then you'd only need 1,000 of them to make a living. Or, maybe it's only $50, but then you need 2,000. But the order of magnitude is roughly in the thousands, instead of thinking that you need millions to survive, to make a living as an artist or as a creator. In the past, you did need to make millions because there was all these other people and intermediaries involved that were consuming what people were giving you. But if you have direct connection with them, with like social media or with email or mailing list, and with these days with like crowdsourced funding, where you actually have people connecting and paying you directly for something, then that reduces the numbers to a much more manageable in the thousands. And thousands is a lot more achievable, even thinking about it, than like I need to have a 1 million hit bestseller to make a living doing this.
Right.
So I emphasize that this is making a living, not making a fortune. And the numbers are a little, depending on where you live, and if you have more people, if you have a partner, you have to, divide by 2 or multiply by 2, and that also that it's at least a half-time job for the creator to maintain this kind of audience. And so some people, some artists, some creators, inventors just aren't really made and don't really want to do that stuff with the fans, and so they need to have someone else, and so you have to change your numbers there, but because it does require a lot of nurturing and feeding. But if you're willing to, and it's a good way to start, to feed your fans, that you only need 1,000-ish true fans, and then there's all these kind of regular fans who will buy some of your things. But if you can have 1,000, and finally the thing about the 1,000 is that the other thing the internet technology does is it connects basically everybody on this planet, and that's several billion people and headed towards multi-billion people, which means that even if you are interested in something that where only 1 in a million people are also going to be interested in it, you still have, with a couple billion people, thousands of potential fans. So the most esoteric, the most obscure, the most niche passion that you today have the potential of finding at least 1,000 other people who share that. So that's really good news for everybody, because it means that your passion can probably make you a living if you wanted it to.
It's a great article for anyone listening, and I highly recommend it, especially if you're kind of an entrepreneur or a small business owner. I think it's very valuable. Kevin, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. What are you working on this year? You mentioned that Asia is kind of your focus now. What are you working on, and where can people find you, follow you, and connect with you?
Yeah, let me just answer the last, because that's really all I have time for. Can be found at my initials, kk.org. I'm working on a book about vanishing Asia, and my latest thing is a newsletter that I do with Mark Frunfelder and Claudia at Cool Tools. Is we send out 6 really brief recommendations every week, every Sunday, on a 1-page email called Recommendo with 1M, recommendo.com. Sign up and you'll get 6 recommendations for us every week.
And those are like the Cool Tools type recommendations. Cool Tools.
They're tips. They're tips. Stuff that we listen to, watch, read, eat. It's other things and tools, although occasionally there are some tools. But it's just things that we recommend and we use ourselves. So I want to thank you for having me. It's really been great, Jay, that you had me on, and I'm really glad to share some of my stories in Asia. I would love talking about it more.
Absolutely.
But I hope I was useful, and I appreciate being asked.
Definitely. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. And yeah, guys, go sign up for Kevin's newsletter, his new newsletter, Recommendo. That's right? Okay.
Yep.
Great.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kevin. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. All the show notes and links can be found over at jkimshow.com. Come back often and make sure you subscribe, rate, and review. Don't forget to join us next week for another exciting episode of The Jay Kim Show. I'd love to hear your comments. You can find me on Twitter at JayKimmer, JayKimmer. See you guys next week. This podcast is brought to you by Hack Your Fitness, the high achiever's guide to getting ripped in under 3 hours a week. If you're anything like me, you're probably working a full-time job or jobs and trying to find time to balance family life, social life, and last but not least, fitness. Look, I get it. I'm a full-time investor and entrepreneur myself, and father of 2. So how am I able to stay fit year-round without spending hours and hours in the gym killing myself on the cardio machine? After struggling for the last 15 years trying every workout and diet under the sun, I finally designed a system that allows me to achieve and maintain single-digit body fat for life in under 3 hours a week. Cardio not required. Head on over to hackyour.fitness and download my free 13-page guide that teaches you the simple science behind efficient fitness and smart nutrition and gives you everything you need to know to finally take control of your life. That's hackyour.fitness.